Dostoevsky's protagonist, the underground man in Notes from Underground, covers many different philosophical concepts. One of them was utopianism. I'd even go to say that this book is one of the best books which critique utopianism, guided by a rational positivism. The main argument against utopianism for the underground man is that there is no existence of rationality in mankind. Because of this, a scientific positivism and rational egoism to formulate a utopian society is impossible. Why? Because man is fundamentally irrational. Mankind cannot be slotted into a fitting compartment of meaningful, purposeful existence and be content forever. We are not questionable subjects with a definite corresponding answer. If anything, we are questionable subjects and indefinite creatures when it comes to finding meaning and purpose in our lives. What is most evident is this: as Dostoevsky writes, we are very much like chess players, fond of the process of achieving his or her goals rather than reaching the goal itself. Perhaps the whole goal towards which mankind is striving in this world consists solely in the uninterrupted process of achievement. As I quote, "Man loves to construct and lay down roads, no question about it, but why is he so passionately fond of destruction and chaos? Just as an ant will build an anthill and finish such with a positive outlook, man is much more a superficial and unseemly creature. 2 × 2 is 4. This is very much the formula that Dostoevsky uses as an example of the rational mathematical principle which is to be foundation to the building of the rational utopian positivist world. But the underground man finds distaste in this, because it does not follow the human nature that we live by, that people are not piano keys or organ stops by which he refers. If a formula so does exist, then man will stop desiring. He will be man without volition, without human nature. It will become calculated into logarithms, whereby all will have a sound, manageable, expected, predictable conclusion. This formula he speaks of is no longer life, but the beginning of death itself. As I quote, "Man has always somehow been afraid of this 2 × 2 is 4, and I'm still afraid of it. Let's suppose that man does nothing but seek out his 2 × 2 is 4 formula, sails across oceans, devoting his life to the quest, but never really finding it. God, he's afraid of it somehow. You see, he feels that once he found it, there'll be nothing left to look for. Where can man go?" End quote. I love this because he alludes to God here. I personally think this is strikingly intentional. In the age of modernity, the Enlightenment, the irrational principle expelled onto man's complete earthly disposition, will make man nihilistic, deprived, godless. I see it really as man being afraid of losing God in the process, and that he is afraid of what this formula will do to everything and everything that man has known. I quote, "What will become of your will once the whole business ends up with tables and arithmetic? When only 2 × 2 is 4 is in demand. 2 × 2 will make 4 without my willing it. So much for your will." End quote. Here Dostoevsky is referring to the core advantageous advantage of the human spirit, which is free will, that which makes you irrational. The catalyst for that irrationality, which is excessive free will be lost forever. So let me get to the fundamental point that makes this book truly important. To be honest, the most frightening element of this book. He talks about the rational utopia, the end of free will being the catalyst for your innate irrationality, how everything will be predicted through tables of a positivist perspective, and how it will never work, so on and so on, but he makes a crucial distinction. That in all its attempts, because of the primary importance of free will in all of mankind, the glass will crack, and that the modernist scientific rational outlook is very much a fallacy. I quote, "One may say anything about the history of the world, anything that might enter the most disordered imagination. The only thing one cannot say is that it is rational. The very word sticks in one's throat. And indeed, this is even the kind of thing that continually happens. After all, there are continually turning up in life moral and rational people, sages and lovers of humanity, who make it their goal for life to live as morally and rationally as possible, to be, so to speak, a light to their neighbours, simply in order to show them that it is really possible to live morally and rationally in this world. And so what? We all know that those very people sooner or later, towards the end of their lives, have been false to themselves, playing some trick, often a most indecent one. Now I ask you, what can one expect from man since he is a creature endowed with such strange qualities? Shower him every earthly blessing, drown him in bliss so that nothing but bubbles would dance on the surface of his bliss, as on a sea. Give him such economic prosperity that he would have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with ensuring the continuation of world history, and even then, man out of sheer ingratitude would play you some loathsome trick. He would even risk his cakes and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive rationality his fatal, fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly, that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were so necessary, that men are still men and not piano keys, which even if played by the laws of nature themselves, threaten to be controlled so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by the calendar. And after all, that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even this were proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposely do something perverse out of sheer ingratitude, simply to have his own way. And if he does not find any means, he will devise destruction and chaos, will devise sufferings of all sorts, and will thereby have his own way. He will launch a curse upon the world, and, as only man can curse, it is his privilege, the primary distinction between man and other animals, then, after all, perhaps only by his curse will he attain his object, that is, really convince himself that he is a man and not a piano key. If you say that all this too can be calculated and tabulated, chaos and darkness and curses, so that the mere possibility of calculating it all beforehand would stop it all and reason would reassert itself, then man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and have his own way. I believe in that. I vouch for it, because after all, the whole work of man seems really to consist in nothing but proving to himself continually that he is a man and not an organ stop. It may be at the cost of his skin, but he has proved it. He may become a caveman, but he will have proved it. And after that can one help sinning, rejoicing that it has not yet come, and that desire still depends on the devil knows what. End quote. That to me is the most frightening part of the book, the most true of it all, but it is that man will deliberately go insane in order to be rid of reason and still have things his own way. And it is if you spot the associations, Dostoevsky is pointing towards the downfall of an attempted utopia, a fall into a dystopia, because man cannot be a rational being with cohesive, conclusive counterparts. You could say that Dostoevsky predicts the not-so-distant future of mathematical madnesses such as the Soviet and communist Chinese state, and of course the German-Italian authoritarianism of the early 20th century. This is of utmost importance, that man can't remain as a piano key in an attempted utopia, but that it will be a dystopia of authoritarianism, that the underground men who reside in the cracks of the earth will rise and use their resentment as political charisma. Who could be a better example than Hitler? A man who had the physical and behavioural attributes of the underground man himself, and someone who used resentment and what Nietzsche called imaginary revenge to create a world of chaos and destruction. Dostoevsky acknowledges the madness of man and mankind's irrationality, but most importantly that this is an extremely delicate thread, that when man attempts to constrict its own human nature, it may create a disastrous chemical reaction, that the strange human condition which we are may produce not a utopianism followed by rationality, but a dystopian authoritarianism, which is guided by powers that desire to demonstrate the devil's own free will. Free will for the sake of free will, a will which is made into reality to prove that man is not rational and cannot be equally placed as jigsaw to form a finality of perfect happiness. So Orwell. The reason why I am going to compare this to Orwell is because 1984 sees the same key points but through a different lens. Instead of a book that panders towards the irrationality of man and that the most advantageous of all advantages is free will, it instead plays out what Dostoevsky says in his book. It brings to light Dostoevsky's conclusion in how hyper-rationalism can influence totalitarian irrationalism, which represents the disappearance of the human personality, the dystopian world of 1984. Apply both to Stalin and Hitler's regimes, which can be seen as caused by excessively perverted outgrowths coming from Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment ideals. I first want to talk about the formula where 2 × 2 = 4, which represents the rational, but another formula is used in both Notes from Underground and 1984 to represent the irrational. This formula is 2 × 2 = 5. This is a key signifier that makes these two books stand out much more than any other dystopian novels, because both refer to the reality of an irrational formula as something that does happen, something that does emerge from the cracks and can, as we can see in 1984, cause for a dystopian irrationality. As I quote from Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky writes, "I admit that 2 × 2 = 4 is an excellent thing, but if we are going to praise everything, 2 × 2 = 5 is something also a very charming little thing." End quote. The same approach is taken in Orwell's 1984, as I quote, "You are a slow learner, Winston," said O'Brien gently. "How can I help seeing what is in front of my eyes? 2 and 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston, sometimes they are 5. End quote. So here both these books are erring towards and acknowledging the fact that hyper-reality or rational dictatorship in a desire for a utopia can turn violently into a irrational authoritarianism. A key difference between the two books is that the underground man himself is very much fighting against a rational utopia, as if it is something that will be accepted as the ultimate truth, that it will be nothing but the salvation since the death of God. But in 1984 it is different. The rulers in the book have abandoned the ideal of a universal happiness, but still use the concept of a universal happiness for propaganda purposes. We also see that Goldstein alludes to the fact that the machine was worthwhile and that a true utopia was possible, while the underground man knows that it will never work. Orwell alludes through one character that it could. I quote, "From the moment when the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent for human inequality, had disappeared. If the machine were used deliberately for that end, hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations. And in fact, without being used for any such purpose, but by a sort of automatic process, by producing wealth which it was sometimes impossible not to distribute. The machine did raise the living standards of the average human being very greatly over a period of about 50 years, at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. The earthly paradise had been discredited at exactly the moment when it became realizable. Every new political theory, by whatever name it called itself, led back to hierarchy and regimentation." End quote. Notes from Underground and Brave New World don't represent abandoned utopias like 1984, but realized utopias from the eyes of a society or from what society expects. Notes from Underground speaks out about what can happen, such as what happens in the authoritarian dystopia of 1984, but also predicts the Nazi communist regimes, as it was written before such devastations happened, unlike Orwell's 1984, which was written by influence of such happenings. A character that represents a lot of the characteristics of the underground man in 1984 is O'Brien, the antagonist. He displays lunatic enthusiasm, when in a heated discussion with Winston, when he rejects the notion of scientific positivism and that reality can be rewritten by those in power. He even claims that laws of nature are merely human constructs, which is a very Nietzschean perspective. I quote, "We control matter because we control the mind. Reality is inside the skull. You will learn by degrees, Winston. There is nothing that we could not do. Invincibility, levitation, anything. I could float off this floor like a soap bubble if I wished to. I do not wish to, because the party does not wish it. You must get rid of those 19th century ideas about the laws of nature. We make the laws of nature." End quote. So here the power of man's free will has taken power over the rational positivist utopia. The will to power, in its most devastating form, has taken hold through irrational free will, the most advantageous of all human advantages. O'Brien can be seen with a very sadistic attitude and behaviour, which is similar to the underground man when it comes to demanding dogmatic language. For example, how O'Brien attempts to re-educate Winston, and how the underground man tries to reform the prostitute Lisa, but also how the underground man early on in the book talks about how he finds strange pleasures in things he shouldn't. What makes O'Brien interesting compared to the underground man is that he is not resentful over him being a so-called piano key, which the underground man is distasteful of. This represents a clear contrasting point. O'Brien is more comfortable with this reality and sees it as the foundation to the majority of his purpose, meaning and identity. I quote, "Alone free, the human being is always defeated. It must be so, because every human being is doomed to die, which is the greatest of all failures. But if he can make complete, utter submission, if he can escape from his identity, if he can merge himself in the party, so that he is the party, then he is all-powerful and immortal." End quote. O'Brien represents a key psychological state in this regard. He uses sadistic desires to overcome the dichotomy of positivist determinism and human freedom by merging them together, by making a determinist radical freedom based on sadistic pleasures and desires, which can be described as simply authoritarian. When there is an embodiment of the underground man's resentment in a human, there is also a possibility for extraordinary violence and rage via political movement. This can be caused by what I quote from Dostoevsky beforehand, as I quote again, "Man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and go his own way," end quote. Or more precisely, the authoritarian way, as due to irrationality, man cannot keep himself within the confounds of rational positivism and mathematically predicted action that the New World is trying to conclude us in. This is why Dostoevsky is said to have supposedly predicted the happenings of the Soviet Union and authoritarian regime in Europe. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe and comment down below to get involved in the discussion. Talking about discussion, you can find a link to the New Thoughts on Thinking Facebook group down below, so make sure to join if you want to get involved in conversations about philosophy, sociology, psychology and literature. Make sure to follow my social medias such as Instagram, Twitter and Patreon, where you can donate a minimum of $2. And lastly, a quick shout out to my patrons. Thank you to Danielle Kazmi, The Truthism, Noah and Danny for supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for watching and I will speak to you in the next video.